Georges Bataille, The Conquering Society, Islam, an excerpt from the Accursed Share. The difficulty of giving a meaning to the Muslim religion. Islam, the religion of Muhammad, is together with Buddhism and Christianity one of the three world religions. It takes in a substantial portion of the population of the globe, and provided the faithful fulfill specific moral obligations in his lifetime, it promises beatitude after death. Like Christianity, it affirms the existence of a single God, but it is adamant concerning his unicity. It regards the dogma of the Trinity as an abomination. The Muslim only recognizes one God, of whom Muhammad is the messenger, but Muhammad has no access to God's divinity. He is not like Jesus, who partakes of both man and God, a mediator between two worlds. There is no attenuation of Islam's divine transcendence. Muhammad is only a man, honored by decisive revelation. In theory, these tenets adequately define Islam. We shall add to them the recognition, on a secondary plane, of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Muslims speak of Abraham and of Jesus, but the latter is only a prophet himself. There remains the rather well-known history of Muhammad's disciples, the conquests of the first caliphs, the dislocation of the empire, the successive invasions of the Mongols and the Turks, followed by the decline of the Muslim powers in our time. All this is clear, but only superficially so. If we try to enter into the spirit that determined the vast movement and ordered the lives of countless multitudes over centuries, we do not see what could have touched us personally, but only formal particulars, whose attraction for the faithful we can only sense by imagining the local color of costumes, of strange cities, and a whole series of hieratic attitudes and gestures. Muhammad himself, whose life is well known to us, speaks a language that does not have the clear and irreplaceable meaning for us that Buddha's or Christ's has. If only we are alert, Buddha or Christ speak to us, but Muhammad to others. So true is the above that whenever the undeniable seduction that we feel tries to express itself in words, we don't know what to say. The principles then appear as they are, foreign to what affects us. We can only resort to platitudes. One cannot doubt the sincerity or the competence of Emil Durkheim, where, at the conclusion of the rich volume which the Cahiers du Sud has recently devoted to Islam, he outlines the values that Islam conveys to us. It is no use blaming anything but an irreducible difficulty. But the fact that the emphasis is placed on freedom as against servitude, on gentleness as against violence, is surprising, and indicative of the perplexity of someone trying to formulate a deep attraction. When Durkheim speaks of freedom, he is expressing the attraction he feels both to freedom and to Islam, but the quotations he offers are unconvincing. God does not love oppressors, says the Quran. One grants the antithesis of the idea of God in an unjust oppression, but this is not a Muslim trait, and one cannot fail to note the generally despotic nature of sovereignty in Islam. Is freedom not based on revolt, and is it not the same thing as unsubmissiveness? Now, the very word Islam means submission. A Muslim is someone who submits. He submits to God, to the discipline that God demands, which is consistent with that demanded by his lieutenants. Islam is discipline as opposed to the capricious virility, the individualism of the Arabs of the polytheistic tribes. Nothing is more contrary to the ideas that the virile world, freedom, evokes in our minds. A passage on war is no less strange. Durkheim is doubtless right to underscore the fact that for Muhammad, the great holy war is not that of the Muslim against the infidel, but that of the renunciation one must engage in against oneself. He is also right to illustrate the moderate character of Islam by reference to the humanity shown in its first conquests. But if one speaks of war apropos of the Muslims in order to praise them, it is best not to separate this moderation from their principles. In their eyes, every violent action against infidels is good. From the first period, at Medina, the disciples of Muhammad lived by pillaging. On the occasion of a Muslim raid, says Maurice Godefroy de Montbien, the Quran told the Muslims to fight even though the raid was carried out in violation of the truce of the pre-Islamic sacred months. The Hadith, the written tradition and a kind of code of ancient Islam, organized the conquest systematically. It excluded needless exactions and acts of violence. The regimen imposed on those defeated persons who came to terms with the victor had to be humane, especially if it was a question of men of scripture, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. These are only subjected to taxation. Likewise, the Hadith ordained that the crops, trees, and irrigation works should be respected. But the Imam of the Muslim community must wage jihad, or holy war, against the peoples of the war territory immediately adjacent to the territory of Islam. The leaders of the army must make sure that these people know the teachings of Islam and that they refuse to follow them. It is then necessary to fight them. The holy war was permanent, therefore, at the borders of Islam. There was no real peace possible between Muslims and infidels. This was an absolute theoretical notion that could not be held up against the facts. And a juridical expedient had to be found, the hila, for circumventing it while conforming to it. The doctrine granted that the Muslim princes might enter into truces with the infidels, lasting 10 years at the most, in the case of an insurmountable weakness of the Muslim state and in the latter's interest. They were free to break them at will, provided they atoned for their violated oath. How could one fail to see a means of expansion, of indefinite growth in these precepts, one that is perfect at the same time in its principle and its effects and the duration of its effects? Some of Derganam's other views are also in the nature of vague approximations, but this clear question emerges. How does one grasp the meaning of an institution that has outlived its reason for being? Islam as a disciple applied to a methodical effort of conquest. The completed enterprise is an empty framework. Thus, the moral riches Islam holds are of those in mankind in general, but its external consequences are more marked, less unstable, and more formal. The Arab societies of consumption before the Hegira. If we are to define the meaning of the Prophet's discipline of Islam, we cannot leave off at its survival, which in our view preserves the beauty of death or of ruins. Islam opposes to the Arab world where was born determination that made an empire out of elements that were scattered until then. We are relatively well informed about the small Arab communities, no larger than the tribe, which had a difficult existence before the Hegira. They were not always nomadic, but the difference between the nomads and the sedentary inhabitants of the poor villages, such as Mecca or Yathrib, the future Medina, was relatively slight. Within the confines of harsh tribal rules, they maintained a stormy individualism to which the importance of their poetry is connected. The personal and tribal rivalries, the bouts of bravura, of gallantry, of prodigality, of eloquence, of poetic talent, played the greatest role in them. Ostentatious giving and squandering were rampant, and one can doubtless infer the existence of a ritual form of potluck from a prescription of the Quran. Do not give in order to have more. Having remained polytheistic, many of these tribes had bloody sacrifices. Others were Christian or Jewish, but then it was the tribe and not the individual which had chosen the religion, and it is doubtful that the way of life was changed very much as a result. Blood vengeance, the obligation for the relatives of a man killed to take their revenge on the killer's relatives, completed this tableau of wasteful acts of violence. Assuming that the neighboring regions, endowed with a strong military organization, were closed to the possibility of expansion, this spendthrift way of life can ensure a lasting equilibrium. The frequent killing of the female newborn helped to prevent overpopulation. But if the neighbors had weakened, the maintenance of a way of life that did not provide for a joining of forces would not have allowed these people to take advantage of the fact. A preliminary reformation of customs, the formulation of a preliminary principle of conquest, of enterprise and unification of forces, were necessary before any aggression can be undertaken, even against states in decline. Apparently Muhammad did not mean to respond to the possibilities that resulted from the weakness of the neighboring states, but his teaching nonetheless had the same effect as it would have had if he had clearly intended to profit from the occasion. Properly speaking, these pre-Islamic Arabs had not reached the stage of military enterprise any more than the Aztecs had. These ways of life correspond to the principle of a society of consumption. But among people of the same stage, the Aztecs had exercised a military hegemony. The Arabs, whose neighbors were Sassanid Iran and Byzantium, were forced to vegetate. Nascent Islam, or society reduced to military enterprise. The Pietism of primitive Islam, writes H. Olma, would certainly deserve to be studied and examined more closely, especially since Max Weber and Sombart have clearly shown the importance of the pietist way of thinking in the origins and development of capitalism. This remark by the Finnish writer is all the more pertinent since the pietism of the Jews and the Protestants was motivated by intentions alien to capitalism. It nevertheless resulted in the birth of an economy in which the accumulation of capital dominated to the detriment of consumption, which was the rule in the Middle Ages. In any case, Muhammad could not have done any better if he had set out to transform the reckless and wasteful agitation of the Arabs of his time into an effective instrument of conquest. The action of Muslim Puritanism is comparable to that of the manager of a factory in which disorder has taken hold. He takes wise measures to fill the gaps in the plant that have drained off the energy and reduced the output to nothing. Muhammad opposed Murwa, the glorious and individual ideal of virility of the pre-Islamic tribes, with the din, with faith and submissive discipline. Richelieu, combating the traditions of feudal honor, the duel, chose the same direction deliberately. He forbade blood vengeance within the Muslim community, but allowed it against infidels. He condemned the killing of infants, the use of wine, and the gift of rivalry. He replaced his gift-giving for the sake of pure vainglory with the socially useful giving of alms. Render your close relative his due, as well as the pauper and the wayfarer, yet do not squander extravagantly. Spendthrifts are the devil's brethren, says the Quran. Extreme generosity, a major virtue of the tribes, suddenly became an object of aversion, and individual pride was condemned. The squandering, intractable, and savage warrior, lover and beloved of young women, hero of the tribe's poetry, gives way to the devout soldier, the formal observer of discipline and rites. The custom of praying in common was a constant external affirmation of this change. It has rightly been compared to military exercise, which unifies and mechanizes hearts. The contrast of the Quran and the Hadith with the capricious world of poetry symbolizes this repudiation. It was only after the irresistible wave of conquest by the devout army that the tradition was resumed. Victorious Islam was not held to the same severity. Generous squander, for which the longing remained, ceased to be a danger once the empire had consolidated its domination. The alternation of austerity, which accumulates, with prodigality, which dissipates, is the ordinary rhythm and the use of energy. Only relative austerity and the absence of dissipation allow for the growth of the energy systems that living beings or societies constitute. But, at least for a time, growth has its limits, and it is necessary to dissipate the excess that cannot be accumulated. What gives Islam a place apart in these movements is the fact that it was open from the start to an apparently unlimited increase of power. This was by no means a consistent plan or project, but chance realized every possibility, and chance was supported by a minimum of necessity. It is relatively easy to assemble people by inspiring them with a particular enthusiasm, but one must give them something to do. To assemble, to exalt is first of all to elicit an unapplied force. This force cannot follow its impetus and to press forward unless it is used the moment it becomes available. From the first, Islam was fortunate in having to set itself violently against the world in which it originated. Muhammad's teaching opposed it to the tribe whose traditions it blasphemed. The tribe threatened to exclude it, which is equivalent to death. It thus had to repudiate the tribal relationship, and since an existence without ties was not conceivable at the time, it had to establish a different type of bond between it and its adherents. This was the meaning of the Hijrah, which probably began the Muslim era. Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina consecrated the rupture of blood ties and the establishment of a new community based on chosen brotherhood, open to anyone who adopted its religious forms. Christianity dates from the individual birth of a redeeming God, Islam from the birth of a community, a new kind of state, which should not have its basis in either blood or place. Islam differs from Christianity and Buddhism in that it became, after the Hijrah, something different from a teaching propagated in the framework of a society already formed, a local or blood community. It was the establishment of a society based on new teaching. This principle was in a sense perfect. There was no room for ambiguity or compromise. The religious leader was at the same time the legislator, the judge, and the military chief. One cannot imagine a more rigorously unified community. The social bond had its origin in will alone, but will cannot break it, which offered the advantage not only of ensuring a deep moral unity, but also of opening Islam to indefinite expansion. It was an admirable machinery. Military order replaced the anarchy of rival clans, and individual resources, no longer consumed wastefully, went into the service of the armed community. Once the obstacle, the tribal boundary that formerly stood in the way of growth, had been removed, the individual forces were kept in store for military campaigns. Conquest, which the Hadith methodically fashioned into a means of expansion, invested in new resources, without appreciable destruction, in a close system of forces that grew larger and larger at a faster and faster rate. This movement recalls the development of industry through capitalist accumulation. If waste is halted, if development no longer is a formal limit, the efflux of energy dictates growth, and growth multiplies the accumulation. So in common, a perfection is not without its other side, however. If one compares the Muslim conquest with the development of the Christian or Buddhist religion, one soon notes the relative powerlessness of Islam. The fact is that the formation of power demands that one forego its use. The development of industry requires a limit on consumption. Equipment gets first priority. Immediate interest is subordinated to it. The very principle of Islam implied the same order of values. Life loses its immediate power of disposal to the pursuit of a greater power. In avoiding the moral weakness of the Christian and Buddhist communities, forced to serve an unchanged political system, Islam fell into a greater weakness, the consequence of a complete subordination of religious life to military necessity. The pious Muslim renounced not only the wasteful expenditures of the tribal world, but also, as a general rule, any expenditure of force that was not an external violence turned against the infidel enemy. The internal violence that found religious life and culminates in a sacrifice played only a secondary role in the Islam of the first period. For Islam is defined not by consumption, but, like capitalism, by an accumulation of available forces. In its primary essence, Islam is unacceptable to any dramatization, to any transfixed contemplation of drama. There is nothing in it corresponding to Christ's death on the cross or to Buddha's rapture of annihilation. Like the military sovereign who unleashes his violence against the enemy, it sets itself against the religious sovereign who undergoes violence. The military sovereign is never killed and even tends to put an end to sacrifices. He is there to direct the violence from outside and to preserve the vital force of the community from internal consumption, from ruination. He is committed from the start to the path of appropriations, of conquests, of calculated expenditures whose purpose is growth. Islam is in a sense, in its unity, a synthesis of religious and military forms. It has curtailed sacrifices, limiting religion to morality, almsgiving, and prayer observance. Late Islam, at a return to stability. Given its foundation and its conquests, the meaning of Islam gets lost in the constituted Muslim empire. As soon as Islam ceased, because of its victories, to be a rigorous devotion of vital forces to growth, it remained nothing but an empty, rigid framework. What came to it from elsewhere was not taken into this rigorous cohesion without being transformed. But except for the cohesion, there is nothing in it that was not given before it. It quickly opened itself to the influence of the conquered lands, whose riches it inherited. It is more than a little strange that once the conquests were consolidated, the underlying Arab civilization, the negation of which had been a founding principle, recovered its vitality and continued much as before. Something of that Marua of the tribes, to which Muhammad opposed the rigors of the Quran, subsisted in the Arab world, which maintained a tradition of chivalrous values in which violence was combined with prodigality and love with poetry. Moreover, what we ourselves have from Islam does not partake of Muhammad's contribution, but precisely of those condemned values. It is curious to recognize an Arab influence in our chivalrous religion, so different from the institution of chivalry revealed in the Chanson de Ye, the latter being quite foreign to the Muslim world. The very expression chivalrous took on a new meaning during the time of the Crusades, a poetic meaning tied to the value of passion. In the 12th century, in the West, the ordinary interpretation of the ritual of armament was Muslim. And the birth in the south of France of the poetry of passion apparently extended a tradition going back via Andalusia to those poetry competitions of the tribes that provoked the austere reaction of the Prophet.